Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the incredible true story of the Beatles, the four ordinary young men from Liverpool who became the most famous band the world had ever seen. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow, relaxing history stories that help you unwind or fall asleep, please subscribe to the channel and join us for more peaceful journeys through the past. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let the story begin. In the late 1950s, Liverpool was a busy port city in northern England. Still recovering from the hardships of World War II, it was not the kind of place where anyone expected global superstars to be born. The streets were gray, opportunities were limited, and many young people dreamed of escaping ordinary life. Among them were four teenagers with a shared passion for music. John Lennon was bold, witty, and rebellious. Paul McCartney was disciplined, talented, and endlessly creative. George Harrison was the quiet perfectionist who practiced for countless hours, while Ringo Starr brought a calm personality and a unique style behind the drums. Together, they formed a group that would eventually change music forever. At first, however, success seemed very far away. They performed in small clubs where audiences barely paid attention, playing for little money and carrying their own equipment through rainy streets. Long nights were spent practicing the same songs again and again, hoping that every performance would be slightly better than the last. Their biggest early challenge came in Hamburg, Germany, where they played exhausting sets that often lasted 8 hours a night. The work was physically demanding, but those endless performances transformed them into confident musicians. Every mistake became a lesson. Every audience taught them something new, and slowly they developed the chemistry that would later amaze millions. When they returned to Liverpool, people immediately noticed the difference. Their performances were tighter, louder, and filled with energy unlike anything local audiences had seen before. Crowds began filling clubs just to catch a glimpse of the young band everyone was talking about. Yet none of them could have imagined that this was only the beginning. Within a few years, their names would be known across continents. Their songs would dominate radio stations, and fans would scream so loudly that the band could barely hear themselves play. But behind the smiles, the photographs, and the unforgettable melodies, a very different story was quietly beginning to unfold. Back in Liverpool, the growing crowds caught the attention of local record store owner Brian Epstein. Unlike many others, he immediately saw something special in the four young musicians. He believed they had the talent to become international stars, but he also knew they needed discipline and a professional image. Epstein encouraged them to replace their leather jackets with tailored suits, arrive on time, bow together after performances, and present themselves with confidence. At first, some of the band members resisted these changes, feeling they might lose part of their identity. Yet, they trusted their manager, and those decisions soon transformed how audiences and record companies viewed them. Even with Epstein's support, success was far from guaranteed. Several record labels rejected the Beatles, believing guitar groups were already becoming old-fashioned. One executive famously claimed that bands with guitars had no future. Looking back today, that prediction has become one of the most famous mistakes in music history. Eventually, producer George Martin at EMI's Parlophone label agreed to give them a chance. During their first recording sessions, Martin recognized that each member brought something unique. John possessed fearless imagination. Paul had an extraordinary gift for melody. George constantly improved his guitar playing, and Ringo, who had recently joined the band, gave their music a steady heartbeat that perfectly tied everything together. Their early singles began climbing the British charts, and suddenly people across the country wanted to know who these four cheerful young men from Liverpool were. Television appearances introduced them to millions of viewers, while newspapers eagerly reported every new achievement. Fans waited outside theaters, hotels, and recording studios for hours just to catch a brief glimpse of the band. Soon, the excitement reached levels nobody had ever experienced before. The media gave this extraordinary phenomenon a name, Beatlemania. Wherever the Beatles traveled, enormous crowds followed them. Young fans screamed with such intensity that the band often could not even hear the music coming from their own instruments during concerts. Police struggled to control the crowds. Airports became packed with thousands of excited supporters, and city streets filled with people hoping to wave as the Beatles passed by. From the outside, it looked like a dream come true. Four ordinary friends had become the most recognizable musicians on earth, yet life behind the scenes was becoming increasingly exhausting. Every journey required heavy security. Every public appearance attracted overwhelming attention, and even a simple walk outside became almost impossible. Privacy slowly disappeared, replaced by endless cameras, interviews, and constant pressure to meet the world's impossible expectations. As Beatlemania spread beyond Britain, the Beatles were invited to perform in the United States, a market that many British artists had struggled to conquer. In February 1964, they landed at New York's airport to find thousands of screaming fans waiting despite the freezing weather. Reporters crowded around them asking endless questions, while television cameras captured every smile and joke. Only a few days later, they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, where more than 70 million Americans watched them perform. It was one of the largest television audiences in history at the time, and overnight, the Beatles became household names across America. Their songs dominated the charts. Their hairstyles became fashion trends, and countless young musicians dreamed of starting bands of their own. Success seemed unstoppable, but fame came with an invisible price. Their daily schedules became relentless. They woke early for interviews, spent hours traveling between cities, rehearsed before concerts, performed before tens of thousands of people, then returned late at night only to repeat the cycle the next morning. Sleep became a luxury rather than a certainty. Hotel rooms often felt like prisons because crowds surrounded the buildings, day and night, shouting their names and hoping for a single wave from a window. Security guards escorted them almost everywhere they went. Even meals were rushed behind closed doors. The freedom they had once enjoyed as ordinary young men had quietly disappeared. As the years passed, each member began changing in different ways. John Lennon became increasingly interested in art, philosophy, and questioning the world around him. Paul McCartney pushed the group toward ambitious new musical ideas, constantly searching for perfection in the recording studio. George Harrison explored spirituality and discovered a deep fascination with Indian culture, music, and meditation. Ringo Starr remained the steady presence of the group, often using humor to ease tense moments during long recording sessions. Their growing individuality made the Beatles more creative than ever, but it also created disagreements that had never existed during their early years. Recording sessions became longer and more complicated, as every song was carefully crafted with new instruments, unusual sounds, and groundbreaking studio techniques. Albums such as Rubber Soul, Revolver, and later Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band transformed popular music forever. Instead of simply recording songs, the Beatles treated the studio like an instrument itself, experimenting with orchestras, tape effects, and sounds that listeners had never heard before. Critics praised their innovation, while millions of fans eagerly waited for every new release. Yet behind the extraordinary music, exhaustion continued to grow. The pressure to constantly create something greater than their previous success weighed heavily on all four men, and the friendships that had once felt effortless slowly began showing signs of strain. By the late 1960s, the Beatles had stopped touring altogether. Many people believed this decision would finally allow them to enjoy a quieter and happier life, but the opposite often proved true. Without the excitement of live performances, almost all of their energy was focused inside the recording studio, where creative differences became impossible to ignore. John preferred bold experimentation and deeply personal lyrics, while Paul wanted polished arrangements and carefully crafted melodies. George, whose songwriting had improved dramatically over the years, hoped more of his own compositions would appear on Beatles albums. Ringo often found himself trying to keep the atmosphere friendly, but even his patience had limits. Recording sessions that once felt exciting sometimes turned into long debates about tiny musical details. Hours could be spent discussing a single verse, a guitar tone, or the order of songs on an album. At times, one member would leave the studio in frustration, while the others continued working. Despite these growing tensions, they somehow continued creating remarkable music. Songs like Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Something became timeless classics, proving that even during difficult moments, their talent remained extraordinary. Outside the studio, each member's personal life was also changing. Relationships, marriages, business responsibilities, and constant public attention made it increasingly difficult for the four friends to spend time together as they once had. The death of their beloved manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967 left an enormous gap in the group. Epstein had often acted as the calm voice that kept everyone moving in the same direction. Without his leadership, important business decisions became sources of disagreement. New managers, financial concerns, and legal arguments slowly created even more distance between the band members. Newspapers eagerly reported every rumor, often exaggerating stories about arguments and possible breakups. Fans around the world desperately hoped the Beatles would remain together forever. But behind closed doors, the friendship that had begun in the streets of Liverpool was becoming increasingly fragile. They still respected one another as musicians, yet their dreams were no longer exactly the same. Each man had started imagining a different future, one where he could follow his own ideas without compromise. The greatest band in the world was still making unforgettable music, but the foundations that had supported their incredible journey for more than a decade were beginning to crack, and the moment that millions of fans feared most was quietly drawing closer. In January 1969, the Beatles gathered once again, with the hope of rediscovering the joy they had felt during their earliest years. The project was simple in theory. They would rehearse new songs together, record an album with minimal studio tricks, and finish by performing live for the first time in years. Cameras followed nearly every rehearsal, capturing both moments of laughter and moments of visible frustration. Some days the atmosphere was warm, filled with jokes that reminded everyone of the young friends from Liverpool. On other days, silence replaced conversation as disagreements over arrangements. Rehearsals and creative direction became harder to ignore. George Harrison briefly walked away from the band after feeling that his ideas were not receiving enough attention. Although he eventually returned, it became clear that the old balance within the group had changed forever. The famous rooftop concert at the Apple Corps headquarters in London became their final public performance. Without announcing it in advance, the Beatles climbed onto the roof on a cold January afternoon and began playing above the busy streets below. Office workers opened their windows. Pedestrians stopped in surprise, and crowds quickly gathered to listen. Police officers eventually arrived after receiving complaints about the noise, but by then the performance had already become legendary. It was a joyful yet emotional moment, as none of the musicians fully realized. They were giving the world their last live concert together. The smiles seen during songs like Get Back hid years of growing exhaustion and uncertainty. Soon afterward, recording continued for what would become Abbey Road. Despite everything that had happened, the four musicians united one last time to create an album that many critics still consider among the greatest ever recorded. Songs such as Come Together, Here Comes the Sun, and the Unforgettable medley on the album's second side demonstrated that their musical connection had not disappeared. Even while personal relationships were becoming strained, they still possessed an extraordinary ability to inspire one another creatively. Yet once the recording sessions ended, the future became impossible to ignore. In April 1970, Paul McCartney publicly announced that he was no longer working with the Beatles. Although legal matters continued for some time, the announcement confirmed what many fans had feared. The band that had changed popular music forever had reached its end. Around the world, newspapers printed the heartbreaking news on their front pages, and millions of listeners struggled to believe that the Beatles would never again record a new album together. Although the Beatles had come to an end, their individual journeys were only beginning. Each member stepped into a new chapter of life with different ambitions and challenges. Paul McCartney quickly formed a new band called Wings, determined to prove that his success had not depended solely on the Beatles. Through years of hard work, Wings produced hit songs and toured the world, allowing Paul to build another remarkable career. John Lennon chose a different path. Living in New York with Yoko Ono, he became deeply involved in peace campaigns and social activism. His songs reflected personal experiences, hopes, and frustrations, showing a more intimate side of the man millions had once known only as a Beatle. George Harrison finally enjoyed the creative freedom he had long desired. His album All Things Must Pass became a major success and revealed the depth of his songwriting. He also organized the historic concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first large-scale charity concerts in history, inspiring future generations of musicians to use their fame to help people in need. Ringo Starr embraced a successful solo career as well, recording cheerful, memorable songs while appearing in films and television. His warm personality made him one of the most beloved drummers in popular music. Even though the four men rarely worked together again, the public never stopped dreaming of a reunion. Every interview Every photograph and every rumor sparked fresh excitement. Whenever two former Beatles appeared together at an event or collaborated on a song, newspapers around the world immediately began speculating that the band might return. Yet a complete reunion never happened. Time had changed all of them. They had grown into different artists with different lives, families, and priorities. Then tragedy struck on the evening of December 8, 1980. John Lennon was returning home to the Dakota Building in New York when he was fatally shot outside the entrance. The shocking news spread across the world within hours. Millions of fans gathered in silence, lighting candles, singing Beatles songs, and mourning the loss of one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Radio stations played Beatles music continuously, while people who had grown up with their songs remembered exactly where they were when they heard the heartbreaking announcement. For Paul, George, and Ringo, John's death ended any remaining hope that the original four friends would ever stand together again. Despite the overwhelming sadness, his music and message continued to inspire countless listeners. The Beatles' story had never been only about record sales or fame. It was about friendship, creativity, ambition, and the extraordinary impact that four ordinary young men from Liverpool had on the entire world. Their songs continued to cross generations, proving that even after the band itself had disappeared, its voice would never truly fall silent. Following John's death, the surviving Beatles gradually found ways to honor both their friend and the extraordinary journey they had shared. In the years that followed, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr occasionally appeared together for special performances and interviews, always aware that people around the world were watching with a mixture of joy and sadness. During the mid-1990s, they reunited for the ambitious anthology project, which explored the complete history of the Beatles through rare recordings, photographs, home movies, and honest conversations. For the first time, fans were able to hear the story directly from the people who had lived it. The project also introduced two new songs built around unfinished demo recordings that John Lennon had left behind. Using modern studio technology, Paul, George, and Ringo carefully added new instrumental parts to John's original vocals, creating Free as a Bird and later Real Love. Although John was no longer alive, listeners felt as if the four friends had briefly reunited once more. It was an emotional moment for millions who had spent decades wishing to hear the Beatles together again. As the years passed, the band's influence continued growing rather than fading. Young musicians who had never seen the Beatles perform still studied their songwriting, harmonies, and recording techniques. Music schools analyzed their compositions, while historians described the group as one of the defining cultural forces of the 20th century. Their albums remained bestsellers. Documentaries introduced them to new generations, and songs written more than half away century earlier continued to be streamed and performed across the globe. In 2001, another heartbreaking chapter arrived when George Harrison passed away after a long battle with cancer. Tributes poured in from every corner of the world. Fellow musicians spoke not only about his remarkable guitar playing, but also about his kindness, humility, and quiet wisdom. His death left Paul and Ringo as the last surviving members of the original band. Even so, they never stopped celebrating the friendship that had begun in Liverpool all those years earlier. Today, visitors still travel to places connected with the Beatles, From Penny Lane and Strawberry Field to the famous crossing outside Abbey Road Studios, their childhood homes have become historic landmarks. And Liverpool welcomes millions of visitors who wish to walk the same streets where four ordinary teenagers first dreamed of making music together. Few stories in modern history demonstrate so clearly how talent, determination, friendship, and opportunity can completely transform the lives of ordinary people. The Beatles did not simply create unforgettable songs. They changed fashion, influenced culture, redefined popular music, and inspired countless artists to believe that impossible dreams could become reality. Even decades after the band's final performance, their melodies continue to bring comfort, joy, and memories to listeners of every generation, ensuring that the story of the Beatles will never truly come to an end. As the 21st century continued, historians began looking at the Beatles not simply as a successful band, but as a cultural phenomenon that permanently changed the modern world. Universities introduced courses examining their music, lyrics, and influence on society. Scholars explored how four young men from a working-class city reflected the hopes, fears, and rapid changes of the 1960s. Their songs became part of history itself. Played during national celebrations, charity events, memorial services, and important public ceremonies. Even people who did not consider themselves Beatles fans often recognized melodies such as Yesterday, Let It Be, and Hey Jude within the first few notes. Their music had become woven into everyday life across generations and continents. Advances in technology also gave new audiences the chance to experience the Beatles in ways that earlier fans never could. Old concert footage was carefully restored. Documentaries revealed unseen moments from recording sessions and previously unheard. Conversations offered a glimpse into the personalities behind the famous faces. In 2021, filmmaker Peter Jackson released the documentary series The Beatles Get Back, using hours of restored film recorded during the band's final recording project. Instead of focusing only on conflict, the documentary showed long stretches of friendship, laughter, playful jokes, and genuine creativity. Many viewers were surprised to discover that even during one of the most difficult periods in the band's history, the four musicians still shared moments of warmth and mutual respect. The series encouraged people to look beyond the headlines that had described only arguments and breakups for decades. It reminded audiences that the Beatles were not perfect heroes or constant rivals. They were human beings trying to balance friendship, ambition, pressure, and artistic passion while living under extraordinary public attention. Today, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr continue to perform, introducing Beatles songs to audiences that include grandparents, parents, and children singing together. Their concerts often become emotional, celebrations of memories that span more than 60 years. Meanwhile, museums preserve handwritten lyrics, instruments, stage clothing, and personal photographs, ensuring that future generations can understand the remarkable journey of the band. Looking back, perhaps the greatest lesson of the Beatles is not simply that they became famous. Countless artists have achieved fame. What makes their story extraordinary is how they constantly challenge themselves to grow. They refused to repeat the same formula forever, embraced new ideas, learned from one another, and transformed popular music again and again. Their journey reminds us that history is often shaped by ordinary people whose passion, persistence, and imagination inspire millions beyond anything they could have dreamed. From the rainy streets of Liverpool to the biggest stages on earth, the Beatles left behind a legacy that continues to echo through every generation, proving that some stories never truly grow old, no matter how much time passes. Even now, decades after the Beatles recorded their final album together, their influence can be found almost everywhere in popular culture. Modern artists from every genre, whether they perform rock, pop, country, jazz, or even classical music, often describe the Beatles as one of their greatest inspirations. Songwriters study the way John and Paul built unforgettable melodies. Guitarists admire George Harrison's tasteful playing, and drummers continue to praise Ringo Starr's creative yet simple rhythms. Many techniques that once seemed revolutionary have now become standard in recording studios around the world. Because the Beatles helped introduce them, producers still analyze how the band layered vocals, experimented with tape effects, and blended different musical styles into a single song. Their willingness to take creative risks encouraged future musicians to think beyond traditional rules. The Beatles also changed the relationship between artists and their audiences. Before their rise, many singers simply performed songs written by professional composers. The Beatles proved that a band could write its own material, shape its own sound, and still achieve worldwide success. This inspired countless young musicians to form groups with friends, write original songs, and dream of building careers through creativity rather than imitation. Their success transformed not only the music industry, but also fashion, film, advertising, and even language. Hairstyles, clothing, and expressions associated with the Beatles quickly spread across the globe. Newspapers once called them a passing trend, yet history showed something very different. More than 60 years later, their music continues to be discovered by people who were born long after. The band had separated. Parents introduced Beatles records to their children, who later share the same songs with the next generation. Few artists have managed to remain so relevant for so long. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the Beatles' story is that it began with four ordinary young men who could never have imagined the future waiting for them. They experienced rejection, uncertainty, exhausting work, overwhelming fame, personal disagreements, heartbreaking loss, and unforgettable success. Their journey reminds us that history is not always created by kings, presidents, or military leaders. Sometimes it is shaped by artists whose ideas, imagination, and determination leave a lasting mark on millions of lives. Long after the final applause faded and the last concert ended, the voices of John, Paul, George, and Ringo continued traveling across the world through radios, records, televisions, streaming services, and the memories of those who listened. The Beatles became more than a band. They became a symbol of creativity, friendship, and the extraordinary power of music to connect people across countries, cultures, and generations. Their remarkable story continues to inspire dreamers everywhere, proving that even the most impossible dreams can begin in the most ordinary places. Although the Beatles' story officially ended in 1970, historians often say that their legacy never truly stopped growing. Every decade brought new listeners who discovered their music for the very first time. Vinyl records gave way to cassette tapes, then compact discs, digital downloads, and finally streaming services. Yet the songs continued to find new audiences. This ability to remain relevant across changing generations is something only a handful of artists have ever achieved. Music critics frequently rank albums such as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Revolver, and Abbey Road among the greatest recordings ever made. Their songs have been translated, covered, and performed by thousands of musicians. In nearly every country on earth, museums display their instruments, handwritten lyrics, and personal belongings as important pieces of cultural history, rather than simple entertainment. Visitors from around the world continue traveling to Liverpool, walking through Penny Lane, visiting Strawberry Field, and standing on the famous Abbey Road crossing to recreate one of the most recognizable photographs in music history. Yet perhaps the greatest reason the Beatles continue to fascinate people is that their story feels deeply human. It is not only a tale of fame and success, but also one of friendship, ambition, disagreement, sacrifice, and change. Four young men chased a dream together, reached heights no band had reached before, faced pressures few people could imagine, and ultimately followed different paths. Their journey reminds us that even extraordinary success cannot prevent the challenges that come with growing older and changing as individuals. At the same time, it also shows how creativity, hard work, and courage can leave a mark that lasts far beyond a single lifetime. More than half a century after the Beatles performed together for the last time, their music still fills homes, concert halls, radio stations, and headphones across the world. New generations continue singing the same melodies that once echoed through crowded theaters in the 1960s. In that sense, the Beatles never truly disappeared. Their voices, ideas, and unforgettable songs remain part of history itself, ensuring that the remarkable story of four boys from Liverpool will continue inspiring people for many generations to come. Beyond the music itself, the Beatles helped transform the way the world thought about creativity. Before their rise, many record companies expected artists to follow proven formulas and avoid taking risks. The Beatles gradually changed that attitude. With each new album, they experimented with fresh ideas, unusual instruments, and recording techniques that had rarely been heard before. They showed that commercial success and artistic innovation could exist together. Their confidence encouraged other musicians to push boundaries rather than simply copy what was already popular. Entire genres of music evolved because artists felt inspired to be more adventurous after listening to the Beatles. Their influence stretched far beyond Britain and America. Young people in Europe, Asia, South America, Africa, and Australia learned English by singing Beatles lyrics, formed local bands inspired by their songs, and created music that blended local traditions with modern rock and pop. In many places, the Beatles became symbols of optimism and youthful imagination during a period when the world was changing rapidly. Historians often describe them as more than entertainers because they reflected the hopes, questions, and dreams of an entire generation. Even today, researchers continue discovering new details about their recording sessions through preserved tapes, studio notes, and interviews with engineers who worked alongside them. These behind-the-scenes stories reveal how much patience and dedication were required to create songs that often sounded effortless. A melody that listeners enjoy in 3 minutes sometimes required dozens of takes, careful discussions, and countless hours of refinement before the band considered it complete. This reminds us that great achievements rarely happen by accident. They are usually built through persistence, collaboration, and an endless desire to improve. The Beatles also demonstrated the importance of teamwork. Although each member possessed remarkable individual talent, their greatest accomplishments came when their different strengths complemented one another. John's bold imagination, Paul's gift for melody, George's thoughtful musicianship, and Ringo's steady rhythm combined to create something far greater than any one of them could have produced alone. Even after their separate careers achieved success, many fans continued believing that the unique chemistry shared by the four friends could never truly be recreated. That rare combination of personalities existed only once in history. Looking back from the present day, the Beatles remain one of the clearest examples of how culture can shape history just as powerfully as politics or war. Their songs continue to accompany weddings, family celebrations, quiet evenings, and moments of reflection around the world. New listeners still discover their music every single day, proving that genuine creativity does not fade with time. The Beatles' story also reminds us how quickly history can turn ordinary moments into unforgettable legends. When John Lennon first met Paul McCartney at a small church festival in Liverpool in 1957, neither of them could have imagined that historians would one day describe that meeting as one of the most important moments in modern music. George Harrison joined soon afterward as a talented young guitarist, and years later, Ringo Starr completed the lineup that would become famous around the globe. At the time, they were simply friends sharing a dream. They had no idea that millions of people would one day memorize their names, collect their records, and study their lives in books, documentaries, and museums. Their earliest performances took place in crowded clubs where audiences were sometimes more interested in talking than listening. Yet those difficult evenings taught them resilience. Instead of giving up after disappointments, they returned to the stage night after night, improving little by little. Historians often point to those years as proof that lasting success is usually built during periods when almost nobody is paying attention. The Beatles earned their confidence through countless hours of practice, long before they experienced worldwide fame. Another remarkable part of their legacy is the respect they gradually gained from fellow musicians. At first, some older artists dismissed them as another passing trend aimed at teenagers. As time passed, however, even legendary composers, producers, and performers admitted that the Beatles had expanded the possibilities of popular music. Their influence reached orchestras, film composers, and artists working in completely different styles. Few musical groups have received such admiration from both critics and ordinary listeners at the same time. Today, the Beatles continue to connect generations in a unique way. Grandparents who remember hearing them on the radio can share those same songs with grandchildren who discover them through streaming services or documentaries. Very few cultural works remain meaningful across so many decades. Yet Beatles music continues to feel familiar to listeners of all ages. Their melodies have become part of weddings, family gatherings, public celebrations, and quiet moments of reflection. In many ways, the Beatles belong not only to British history, but to world history itself. They demonstrated that music has the power to cross borders, languages, religions, and cultures, bringing people together through shared emotions. Their journey began in one city, but its impact reached every corner of the world. More than half a century later, their remarkable adventure still stands, as one of the greatest stories ever told in the history of popular music, reminding us that the most extraordinary legacies often begin with the simplest dreams. The story of the Beatles has now become part of something much larger than the history of a single band. It has become a story about how culture can influence the world for generations. Historians often compare their impact to that of great writers, filmmakers, and artists whose work changed the direction of modern society. While governments rose and fell, technologies evolved, and new musical styles appeared. Beatles songs continued to be played almost everywhere. Their music survived changing fashions because it was built on timeless emotions, hope, love, friendship, loss, curiosity, and the desire to understand life. Those feelings remain the same no matter what decade people live in. Researchers who study popular culture frequently point out that the Beatles arrived at exactly the right historical moment. The world was becoming more connected through television, affordable air travel, and rapidly expanding radio networks. News spread faster than ever before, allowing millions of people in different countries to experience the same performances almost simultaneously. As a result, the Beatles became one of the first truly global entertainment phenomena. Children in Tokyo, teenagers in London, families in New York, and listeners in countless other cities all knew the same songs and recognized the same faces. This level of worldwide recognition had rarely been seen before. Their success also changed how record companies discovered and supported new artists. Instead of searching only for singers with attractive voices, producers began looking for musicians who could write original songs, create unique identities, and connect emotionally with audiences. In many ways, the modern music industry was shaped by lessons learned during the Beatles' remarkable career. Yet, perhaps the most important reason their story continues to endure is because it feels surprisingly relatable despite its extraordinary scale. At its heart, it is the story of four young friends who believed in one another during uncertain times. They practiced relentlessly, accepted criticism, learned from failure, celebrated success, faced disagreements, and eventually followed different paths as life changed around them. These experiences are universal, even if very few people experience them before millions of fans. Every generation finds something different to admire in the Beatles. Some are inspired by their creativity, others by their perseverance, and many simply find comfort in the music itself. That is why, more than 60 years after their journey began, the Beatles remain one of history's greatest examples of how passion, imagination, and friendship can create something that outlives the people who first brought it into the world. Their voices may belong to the past, but their legacy continues to speak to the present and will almost certainly continue, inspiring generations yet to come. In the end, perhaps the greatest achievement of the Beatles cannot be measured by record sales, awards, or the number of songs that reached the top of the charts. Those accomplishments were extraordinary, but history remembers them for something even greater. They proved that music could bring together people from different countries, languages, religions, and cultures in a way that few other forms of art ever had. Long before the internet connected billions of people, Beatles songs were already traveling across oceans, crossing borders, and becoming part of everyday life for families around the world. Their melodies, played from small radios in quiet homes, echoed through crowded concert halls, and accompanied countless personal memories. For many people, a Beatles song became the soundtrack to a first dance, a family celebration, a long journey, or a moment of comfort during difficult times. That emotional connection is one of the main reasons their music continues to survive, generation after generation. Historians often describe this as the difference between popularity and legacy. Popularity can disappear within a few years, but a true legacy continues growing long after its creators are gone. The Beatles achieved exactly that. Every year, millions of people who were born decades after the band separated discover their music for the first time. Some begin with famous songs like Let It Be or Hey Jude, while others explore complete albums and slowly realize how much modern music was influenced by those recordings. Music teachers continue using Beatles compositions to explain harmony and songwriting. Recording engineers study the techniques developed during their studio sessions, while historians examine how the group reflected the dramatic social changes of the 1960s. Few bands have been studied from so many different perspectives. Their story belongs not only to music history, but also to cultural history, media history, and even the history of technology because of the innovations they inspired in recording studios. Looking back across more than 6 decades, it is remarkable to remember where everything began. 4 ordinary boys from Liverpool simply wanted to play music together. They faced rejection, uncertainty, exhausting work, overwhelming fame, personal disagreements, heartbreaking losses, and unforgettable triumphs. Through every stage of that journey, they left behind songs that continue to speak to people of every age. Their remarkable adventure reminds us that history is often shaped not only by political leaders or great battles, but also by artists whose imagination changes the way the world feels, dreams, and remembers. And that is why, even today, the story of the Beatles remains one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of modern music. As the years continue to pass, the Beatles remain a rare example of a group whose reputation has only grown stronger with time. Every new generation seems to rediscover their music in its own way. Some listeners begin with a famous song heard in a film, others find an old vinyl record in a parent's collection, while many discover the band through documentaries, streaming playlists, with social media clips. No matter how people first encounter the Beatles, many soon realize that there is far more to their story than a collection of popular songs. Behind every album lies a chapter of friendship, ambition, creativity, and constant evolution. Unlike many artists who found one successful formula and repeated it, the Beatles were never satisfied with standing still. Each project challenged them to try something different, whether through new instruments, unusual recording techniques, or more thoughtful lyrics. That willingness to keep learning became one of the defining qualities of their career. Even today, musicians often speak about the Beatles not only as performers, but also as fearless innovators who expanded the possibilities of popular music. Their influence can be heard in rock, pop, folk, alternative music, and countless other genres. It is difficult to find a modern songwriter who has not, in some way, been inspired by their work. Beyond the studio and the stage, the Beatles also left behind an important lesson about the nature of success itself. Their journey reminds us that fame is rarely as simple as it appears from the outside. The cheering crowds, sold-out concerts, and worldwide admiration were only one side of the story. The other side included endless travel, overwhelming public attention, exhausting schedules, personal sacrifices, and the challenge of remaining true to themselves, while millions of people expected them to stay the same forever. Their experiences reveal that extraordinary achievement often comes with equally extraordinary pressure. Yet, despite every difficulty they faced, the music they created continued to outshine the conflicts that eventually separated them. Decades later, people remember the songs far more than the disagreements. The melodies endured because they captured emotions that every generation understands. Hope, friendship, love, loneliness, curiosity, and resilience never become outdated. Perhaps that is the true reason the Beatles continue to occupy such a special place in history. Their story is not only about four musicians from Liverpool. It is about the timeless power of imagination, collaboration, and determination. It reminds us that even the most ordinary beginnings can lead to extraordinary destinations when talent is matched with relentless dedication. And although the final chapter of the Beatles was written many years ago, the echoes of their music continue to travel around the world, ensuring that their remarkable legacy remains alive wherever people gather to listen, remember, and dream. Even after countless books, documentaries, and interviews have examined the Beatles from every possible angle, historians continue finding new details that help us better understand their remarkable journey. Letters, studio notes, photographs, and restored recordings reveal not only how they created their music, but also how they lived as ordinary people behind extraordinary fame. These discoveries remind us that history is never completely finished. Every generation asks new questions, and every generation sees familiar stories through a different perspective. Young listeners today often admire the Beatles for their creativity and originality, while older generations remember the excitement of hearing their songs for the first time on the radio. Both experiences are equally valuable because they show how one group of musicians managed to connect people separated by decades. Museums dedicated to the Beatles continue welcoming visitors from around the world. Their childhood homes have been carefully preserved, allowing people to step inside the small rooms where dreams first began. Looking around those modest houses, it becomes almost impossible to believe that four boys from such ordinary backgrounds would eventually influence billions of lives. Their story reminds us that greatness is rarely determined by where someone begins. It is shaped by determination, curiosity, and the willingness to keep improving even when success feels impossible. The Beatles faced rejection before they found recognition, worked exhausting nights before performing on the world's biggest stages, and overcame countless disappointments before becoming international icons. Their journey continues inspiring musicians, writers, artists, and dreamers who hope to create something meaningful of their own. At the same time, their lives also offer an important reminder about balance. Fame brought incredible opportunities, but it also demanded enormous sacrifices. Privacy disappeared, friendships were tested, and expectations grew heavier with every success. The Beatles experienced both the brightest and the most difficult sides of worldwide popularity, making their story far more complex than a simple tale of success. That complexity is one reason historians remain fascinated by them. They were not perfect heroes, nor were they tragic figures defined only by conflict. They were talented individuals whose strengths and weaknesses combined to produce something truly unforgettable. Looking back today, It is clear that the Beatles achieved something very few artists ever accomplish. They did not simply entertain millions of people for a brief moment in history. They created a body of work that continues to inspire conversation, research, admiration, and emotion more than half a century later. Their songs still accompany everyday life. Their story continues to be retold, and their influence can still be heard in the music of new generations. Few legacies endure with such strength, and that is why the Beatles remain one of the greatest cultural phenomena the modern world has ever known. Another reason the Beatles remain such an important part of history is that their influence reaches far beyond music. Fashion designers, filmmakers, photographers, writers, and even advertisers have drawn inspiration from their work. The famous Abbey Road album cover has been recreated thousands of times by artists, tourists, and fans from every corner of the world. What was once a simple photograph of four musicians crossing a street has become one of the most recognizable images ever created. Every day, visitors still gather at that same crossing in London, patiently waiting for traffic to stop so they can recreate the legendary scene. It is remarkable that a single photograph taken in 1969 continues attracting people more than half a century later. This illustrates how deeply the Beatles became woven into modern culture. Their influence is no longer limited to records or concerts. It has become part of global history. Many historians believe the Beatles also changed the expectations people had of musicians. Audiences no longer wanted performers who simply sang popular songs. They wanted artists with unique personalities, original ideas, and the courage to evolve over time. The Beatles embraced that challenge, constantly surprising listeners with every new album. Instead of repeating past successes, they searched for fresh sounds and new ways to express themselves. That creative spirit continues, inspiring musicians who believe that true art should never stop growing. Even the language surrounding popular music changed because of their success. Phrases such as Beatlemania entered dictionaries and became symbols of worldwide excitement surrounding celebrities. Yet behind the extraordinary fame remained four individuals who had once dreamed of nothing more than playing music together. Looking back, perhaps that contrast is what makes their story so compelling. They reached unimaginable heights while never completely escaping the ordinary human. Experiences of friendship, ambition, disappointment, joy, and loss. Their lives remind us that success does not remove life's challenges. It simply changes them. Through every triumph and every setback, they continued creating music that spoke honestly to millions of people. Today, researchers, journalists, and music lovers still debate which Beatles album was their greatest, which song best represents their legacy, and what might have happened if they had remained together longer. Those questions may never receive definitive answers, but perhaps that is part of the magic. The Beatles left behind not only unforgettable songs, but also an endless conversation that continues across generations. Their story encourages people to keep listening, keep learning, and keep wondering about the extraordinary journey of four young friends from Liverpool, whose dreams became one of the greatest cultural stories ever told. Over the years, one question has continued to fascinate historians and music lovers alike. Why has the Beatles' music endured while so many other successful artists gradually faded from public memory? The answer cannot be explained by record sales alone. Countless musicians have sold millions of albums, yet only a small number have remained relevant across multiple generations. The Beatles achieved something much rarer. They created songs that reflected universal human emotions, allowing listeners from different cultures and different periods of history to find their own meaning within the music. Whether someone first heard the Beatles in 1964 or in 2026, the emotions carried by the melodies remain surprisingly familiar. This timeless quality has helped their work survive enormous changes in technology, fashion, and society, from vinyl records and cassette tapes to streaming platforms and digital archives. Every new generation has found a fresh way to experience their music. Historians often point out that the Beatles were not simply witnesses to history. They became part of history themselves. Their rise coincided with a period of enormous global change, including advances in communication, television, and international travel. As the world became more connected, the Beatles became one of the first cultural symbols recognized almost everywhere. Their influence spread far beyond concert halls, shaping conversations about youth, creativity, and artistic freedom. Schools, universities, and museums continue to examine their work because it represents much more than entertainment. It offers insight into an era that transformed modern society. Yet perhaps the most inspiring part of their story is how ordinary it seemed at the beginning. There was no guarantee of success, no promise that their dreams would become reality. They practiced tirelessly, accepted criticism, learned from failure, and continued moving forward despite repeated setbacks. Their journey demonstrates that remarkable achievements are often built through patience rather than instant success. Every difficult performance in a small club, every rejection from a record company, and every long night spent rehearsing became part of the foundation, supporting everything that followed. Looking back today, it is impossible to separate the Beatles from the broader history of the 20th century. Their music became the soundtrack to countless lives, while their story became a reminder that imagination, friendship, and determination can leave an impact far greater than anyone could predict. Even after so many decades, people continue discovering their songs, discussing their legacy, and finding inspiration in the extraordinary path taken by four young friends from Liverpool who changed the world forever. As historians continue studying the Beatles, one conclusion appears again and again. Their greatest achievement was not simply creating unforgettable music, but changing what people believed was possible for a band to accomplish. Before the Beatles, many performers were expected to follow instructions from producers and record companies. Creative decisions often belonged to others. The Beatles gradually changed that tradition by insisting on writing their own songs, experimenting with new sounds, and taking greater control of their artistic direction. That independence inspired future generations of musicians to trust their own ideas instead of relying entirely on commercial expectations. Today, countless artists cite the Beatles as the reason they first picked up a guitar, sat down at a piano, or decided to form a band with friends. Their influence stretches across decades because it is built not only on memorable melodies but also on the courage to keep exploring new possibilities. Every album reflected a willingness to learn, adapt, and improve rather than remain comfortable with past success. This spirit of constant growth remains one of the most valuable lessons their story offers. Historians also note that the Beatles succeeded during a time when communication was far slower than it is today. There were no social media platforms, instant video sharing, or music streaming services. News traveled through newspapers, radio broadcasts, television programs, and word of mouth. Even under those conditions, their popularity spread across nearly every continent with astonishing speed. Crowds gathered outside airports, hotels, recording studios, and concert venues, simply hoping to catch a glimpse of the four musicians. Such worldwide excitement had rarely been witnessed before, making Beatlemania one of the earliest examples of truly global popular culture. Yet, despite all the fame, awards, and recognition, the Beatles never stopped being remembered for something much simpler: the joy their music brought into people's lives. Their songs accompanied celebrations, comforted listeners during difficult times, and created memories shared between generations. Parents introduced the Beatles to their children, who later passed the same music on to families of their own. In this way, the legacy of the Beatles has never depended on a single era. It continues through every new listener who discovers a familiar melody for the first time. That enduring connection between the past and the present is what makes their story so extraordinary. More than 60 years after four teenagers began chasing an unlikely dream in Liverpool, the echoes of their voices continued to travel around the world, reminding us that true greatness is measured not only by success during a lifetime, but by the lasting inspiration left behind for generations yet to come. As time moves forward, the Beatles continue to remind the world that history is not only written through wars, politics, or great discoveries. Sometimes history is shaped by people who inspire others to dream differently. Their journey began with simple ambitions: playing music, improving their skills, and performing for anyone willing to listen. They could never have imagined that future generations would spend decades studying their recordings, preserving their instruments, and celebrating their achievements. Yet that is exactly what happened. Today, historians describe the Beatles as one of the defining cultural forces of the 20th century because they influenced not only music, but also fashion, photography, filmmaking, marketing, and even the relationship between artists and their audiences. Their success demonstrated that creativity could become a universal language understood by people, regardless of nationality or background. It also showed that genuine originality often leaves a deeper mark than simply following popular trends. Many musicians who became famous in later decades openly admitted that without the Beatles, their own careers might never have existed. Entire genres evolved because artists felt encouraged to experiment, write more personal lyrics, and explore sounds that had previously seemed impossible. The Beatles proved that commercial success did not require abandoning artistic curiosity. Instead, they showed that audiences were willing to embrace change when it came from honesty and imagination. This lesson remains relevant even today, long after the final Beatles recording session. Every year, new books, restored recordings, documentaries, and historical exhibitions introduce another generation to their remarkable story. Young listeners continue discovering albums that were originally released before their parents or even grandparents were born. Despite the passing of time, the emotions contained within those songs remain surprisingly fresh. Love, hope, friendship, loneliness, excitement, and reflection are experiences shared by every generation, which is why the music continues to feel timeless. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Beatles accomplished something very few artists ever achieve. They did not simply entertain the world for a brief moment. They permanently changed it. Their influence continues to echo through concert halls, recording studios, classrooms, museums, and millions of homes where their songs are still played every single day. From the small streets of Liverpool to the largest stages on earth, their extraordinary journey stands as a reminder that history often begins with ordinary people who refuse to stop, believing in an impossible dream. And as long as those songs continue to be heard, the story of the Beatles will remain alive, inspiring future generations to create, to imagine, and to believe that even the simplest beginnings can lead to an unforgettable legacy. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Beatles' legacy is that it has never depended on nostalgia alone. Many artists remain popular because people remember their youth. But the Beatles continue attracting completely new audiences who have no personal memory of the 1960s. Teenagers today discover the same albums that fascinated listeners decades ago and often experience the same sense of excitement and curiosity. This ability to speak across generations is exceptionally rare in any form of art. Music. Historians frequently describe the Beatles as timeless because their songs are built upon emotions that never disappear. Happiness, heartbreak, hope, friendship, love, and uncertainty are experiences shared by every generation, making their music feel just as meaningful today as it did when it was first released. Even as technology transformed the way people listen to music, the Beatles remained present. Their songs successfully crossed every major technological change, from vinyl records to cassette tapes, compact discs, digital downloads, and streaming platforms. Few musicians have adapted so naturally to changing times without altering the music itself. Their recordings continue to sound fresh because they were created with extraordinary care and imagination. Engineers and producers still admire the attention given to every harmony, instrument, and recording technique. What once seemed revolutionary has now become part of the foundation of modern music production. Yet beyond all the awards, statistics, and historical achievements lies something even more important. The Beatles gave millions of people moments they would never forget. Families gathered around radios to hear a new single for the first time. Friends learned to play guitars together after hearing Beatles records. Young musicians found the courage to write their own songs because four ordinary boys from Liverpool had shown them that impossible dreams could become reality. These personal memories cannot be measured by charts or trophies, yet they represent the true power of the Beatles' legacy. History is often remembered through dates and events, but it is also remembered through emotions. The Beatles created music that became part of people's lives during celebrations, quiet evenings, long journeys, and moments of reflection. That emotional connection continues to grow with every new listener who presses play for the first time. More than 60 years after their remarkable journey began, the Beatles remain not simply one of the greatest bands in history, but one of the clearest examples of how creativity, friendship, determination, and imagination can leave an influence that extends far beyond a single lifetime. Their story reminds us that while people may grow older and generations may change, truly meaningful art has the extraordinary ability to live forever. Even after more than half a century, the Beatles continued to inspire conversations about what makes art truly unforgettable. Was it their extraordinary songwriting, their willingness to experiment, or the unique friendship that existed between four talented musicians at exactly the right moment in history? Perhaps the answer is a combination of all these things. Historians often argue that the Beatles succeeded because each member contributed something essential that could never be fully replaced. John Lennon's fearless imagination challenged expectations. Paul McCartney's remarkable sense of melody gave countless songs their unforgettable sound. George Harrison brought quiet depth, spiritual curiosity, and elegant guitar work, while Ringo Starr's distinctive drumming provided the steady foundation that held everything together. Individually, they were gifted artists. Together, they became something far greater than the sum of their individual talents. That rare chemistry cannot easily be recreated, which explains why so many musicians continue trying to understand the secret behind their success. Even today, recording studios, music schools, and universities analyze Beatles songs to explore how they achieved such lasting emotional impact. Their recordings demonstrate that technical skill alone is not enough to create timeless music. Curiosity, collaboration, patience, and the courage to take creative risks are equally important. The Beatles were never afraid to leave their comfort zone. Every new project challenged both themselves and their audience, proving that growth often comes from uncertainty rather than familiarity. Looking back, their story also teaches us something about the passage of time. Fame can disappear, trends can change, and generations inevitably move forward. Yet genuine creativity has the power to outlive them all. The Beatles no longer stand together on stage, but their voices continue reaching millions of listeners every year. Their songs remain part of films, documentaries, public celebrations, and personal memories across the globe. For some people, they represent childhood. For others, they symbolize discovery, inspiration, or comfort during difficult moments. Every listener finds something slightly different within the same music, and perhaps that is the greatest achievement any artist can hope for. The Beatles created songs that belong not to one country or one generation, but to the shared cultural heritage of the entire world. Their remarkable journey reminds us that history is often shaped by people who simply followed their passion with determination and imagination. Four ordinary young men from Liverpool dreamed of making music together, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to unite people across languages, cultures, and generations. As long as those melodies continue to be heard, remembered, and shared, the story of the Beatles will never truly reach its final note. In recent years, historians have increasingly emphasized that the Beatles should not be remembered only for their success, but for the lasting influence they had on the creative world. Before their arrival, many people viewed popular music as simple entertainment that would quickly be replaced by the next trend. The Beatles challenged that assumption by creating albums that listeners wanted to experience from beginning to end, rather than hearing only one or two hit songs. They encouraged audiences to pay attention to lyrics, musical arrangements, and the ideas behind every recording. As a result, albums themselves became artistic statements instead of collections of unrelated tracks. This shift transformed the music industry forever and inspired countless musicians to think more deeply about the stories they wished to tell. Even decades later, many of the world's greatest artists continue describing Beatles albums as essential parts of their own musical education. Their influence extends beyond sound alone. Designers still study their album covers. Filmmakers examine their documentaries and films, while photographers admire the images that helped define an entire era. Every aspect of the Beatles' career demonstrated an unusual attention to creativity and originality. Yet perhaps the most inspiring lesson comes from their earliest years, when success seemed almost impossible. They were rejected by record companies, played exhausting performances in small clubs, and spent years improving before the world finally recognized their talent. That part of the story often resonates most strongly with young artists because it reminds them that remarkable achievements are rarely immediate. Behind every legendary success lies an invisible period of hard work that few people ever witness. The Beatles never became extraordinary overnight. Their confidence, musicianship, and chemistry were built through patience, persistence, and an unwavering belief in one another. Looking across history today, it is remarkable that four friends from one English city could leave such a profound mark on global culture. Their songs continue to accompany everyday life, whether playing softly in cafes, filling concert halls, appearing in films, or simply bringing comfort to someone listening alone at home. Every generation seems to rediscover the Beatles from a different perspective, finding new meanings within familiar melodies. That ability to remain relevant across changing times is perhaps the clearest sign of a true legacy. Long after trends have disappeared and countless other names have faded, the Beatles continue reminding the world that imagination, friendship, determination, and a love of creating something meaningful can outlast even the passing of time itself. Their journey began with a simple dream, yet its echoes continue reaching people across the globe, proving that history is sometimes written not only through great events, but through songs that never stop inspiring those who hear them. As historians look toward the future, they often ask an interesting question. What will people think about the Beatles 100 years from now? While no one can know for certain, many experts believe their place in history is already secure. Just as people today still study the works of great classical composers from centuries ago, future generations will likely continue exploring the music of the Beatles as an important chapter in the cultural history of the 20th century. Their recordings have been carefully preserved, restored, and archived using modern technology so they can be enjoyed for decades to come. Every year, new documentaries, books, exhibitions, and research projects introduce another generation to the remarkable story of four young men whose shared dream transformed popular music forever. Historians also note that the Beatles helped demonstrate how culture itself can become a powerful historical force. Their influence reached far beyond concert stages, affecting the way people dressed, spoke, created art, and even viewed the possibilities of youth and imagination. In many ways, they represented a period when society was changing rapidly, and their music became one of the defining voices of that era. Yet, despite all the fame surrounding them, the foundation of their story remained surprisingly simple. Four friends loved making music together, worked tirelessly to improve, trusted their creativity, and refused to stop growing as artists. That simple formula became the source of an extraordinary legacy. Today, millions of people know the Beatles without ever having seen them perform live. They know the melodies, recognize the famous album covers, and continue discovering songs that still sound fresh despite the passing of more than 60 years. Few artists have managed to bridge generations with such consistency. Parents share Beatles music with their children. Teachers introduce students to their recordings, and young musicians continue learning from techniques first explored in those legendary studio sessions. The story has become larger than the individuals themselves. It now belongs to the history of music, the history of culture, and ultimately the shared history of people around the world. Looking back from the present, it becomes clear that the Beatles achieved something impossible to measure with awards or statistics alone. Their greatest accomplishment was inspiring millions of people to believe in the power of creativity, friendship, and perseverance. They showed that remarkable journeys often begin with ordinary people who are willing to work hard for an unlikely dream. From a small city in northern England, 4 young musicians created songs that traveled farther than they ever could have imagined. Those songs continue to echo through homes, classrooms, recording studios, museums, and concert halls across the globe, reminding every new generation that genuine art never truly grows old. And so, even though the final performance has long since ended, and the last recording session became history many decades ago, the legacy of the Beatles continues to play on, one song, one listener, and one generation at a time. Although historians have written thousands of pages about the Beatles, perhaps the most fascinating part of their story is that it still feels unfinished in one important way. Not because the band will reunite or record another album, but because every new generation discovers them through its own eyes. A child hearing "Here Comes the Sun Today" experiences the same feeling of warmth that listeners felt decades ago. A young musician learning "Yesterday" on a guitar begins the same journey of curiosity that inspired countless artists before. In this sense, the Beatles continue creating new memories long after their own careers ended. Very few historical figures remain active in people's everyday lives so many years after their greatest achievements. Yet Beatles songs still play in cafes, weddings, family gatherings, films, television programs, and even quiet evenings at home. Their music has become part of life's ordinary moments, which is perhaps the greatest compliment any artist could receive. Historians often explain that lasting influence is measured not by how loudly people celebrate someone for a short period, but by how naturally that person's work becomes woven into everyday culture. The Beatles reached that remarkable point many years ago. Another reason their legacy continues is that each listener finds something different in their story. Some admire their determination after years of rejection. Others are inspired by the friendship that allowed 4 young men to build something extraordinary together. Many musicians focus on their creativity and constant willingness to experiment, while historians see them as symbols of an era that reshaped modern society. There is no single way to understand the Beatles because their influence extends across so many different areas of history. Their journey reminds us that success is rarely a straight path. It includes moments of excitement, disappointment, celebration, uncertainty, and change. The Beatles experienced all of those stages while living under the attention of millions of people. Yet they continued creating music that spoke honestly to the world. Looking back now, it is difficult to imagine modern music without the paths they opened for those who followed. Their recordings continue teaching new generations about melody, harmony, storytelling, and artistic courage. More importantly, They remind us that remarkable achievements often begin with ordinary dreams shared between friends, from small rehearsals in Liverpool to becoming one of the most influential musical groups in history. The Beatles proved that imagination combined with perseverance can leave a legacy that reaches far beyond a single lifetime. Their story is no longer simply the history of one band. It has become part of the shared cultural history of the world, continuing to inspire listeners wherever their songs are played and remembered. As the final pages of the Beatles' story come into view, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Their greatest legacy was never simply the music they created, but the hope they gave to millions of ordinary people around the world. They showed that remarkable achievements do not always begin in famous cities, wealthy families, or prestigious schools. Sometimes they begin in small houses, crowded streets, and modest neighborhoods where young people dare to believe that their dreams matter. Liverpool was not considered the center of the music world when the Beatles were growing up. Yet through determination, endless practice, and an unshakable belief in one another, four friends transformed their hometown into one of the most recognized cities in music history. Today, visitors travel there not because of grand palaces or ancient monuments alone, but because they want to walk the same streets where John, Paul, George, and Ringo once dreamed about the future. Their story reminds us that history is often shaped by people who refuse to let ordinary circumstances define their limits. Every challenge they faced became another lesson. Every rejection pushed them to improve. Every success encouraged them to reach even higher. Their journey teaches that true greatness is rarely achieved by avoiding failure. Instead, it comes from learning how to continue after disappointment. That lesson remains just as meaningful today as it was more than 60 years ago. Around the world, countless young musicians still form bands with friends because the Beatles proved that extraordinary things can happen when talented people trust one another and work toward a shared goal. Some will never become famous, while others may one day inspire millions themselves. But every one of them begins with the same simple belief that music has the power to connect people. Perhaps that is why the Beatles continue to feel so relevant. Their story is not locked inside the past. It continues every time someone learns their first Beatles song, every time a family sings along in the car, every time a classroom studies their influence, or every time a listener discovers their music for the very first time. History remembers kings, explorers, scientists, and inventors for changing the world in different ways. The Beatles earned their place beside those names by proving that creativity, friendship, and imagination can also change history. Their melodies continue traveling across generations, carrying the same message they always have, that dreams are worth pursuing, that great art can unite people across every border, and that even after the voices of an era have grown silent, the music they leave behind can continue speaking to the world forever. As the years pass, the Beatles continue to stand as a reminder that history is not measured only by the events that happened during a lifetime, but also by the influence those events leave behind. Many bands have enjoyed moments of extraordinary popularity, but very few have continued inspiring people decade after decade. The Beatles achieved something much deeper than commercial success. They became part of the shared memory of the modern world. Their songs have been sung by children who never saw them perform, studied by musicians who were born long after the band ended, and preserved by historians who recognize their importance far beyond the music industry. in classrooms, recording studios, museums, and libraries. The Beatles remain a subject of discussion because their story reflects creativity, friendship, ambition, and the challenges that accompany remarkable success. Every generation seems to ask the same question: what made these four musicians so different? There is no single answer. Some point to their songwriting, others to their willingness to experiment, while many believe their greatest strength was the chemistry they shared when working together. Whatever the reason, the result was a body of work that continues to feel alive many decades later. Even today, new technology restores old recordings with incredible clarity, allowing listeners to hear familiar songs almost as if they had just been recorded. At the same time, young artists continue borrowing ideas first explored by the Beatles, often without even realizing where those ideas originally came from. This quiet influence may be the greatest proof of their lasting legacy. It has become so deeply woven into modern music that it often goes unnoticed. Looking back at their journey from Liverpool to worldwide fame, it is remarkable how much changed in such a short period of time. Four ordinary friends became symbols recognized. Across nearly every country on earth, they experienced triumphs beyond imagination, moments of disappointment, personal growth, and heartbreaking loss. Yet through every stage of that journey, they continued creating music that spoke honestly to millions of people. Their story reminds us that success is not simply about reaching the top, but about leaving something meaningful behind after the applause has faded, long after concert lights have been switched off and recording sessions have ended. The Beatles continue living through the songs that still bring people together. As long as someone discovers their music for the first time, learns a familiar melody on a guitar, or quietly sings along to words written more than half a century ago, the remarkable story of the Beatles will continue, proving that true legends are remembered not because time stands still, but because their influence keeps moving forward with every new generation. In the end, the Beatles remind us of something that reaches far beyond music itself. Every generation searches for stories that offer hope, inspiration, and proof that extraordinary achievements are possible. The Beatles became one of those stories. Their journey began with uncertainty, continued through years of hard work, and eventually transformed into a legacy that has outlived the era in which it was created. They showed that talent alone is never enough. Success required discipline, patience, curiosity, and the courage to continue moving forward when others doubted them. Long before sold-out concerts and worldwide recognition, they spent countless hours practicing in small clubs, refining every performance and learning from every mistake. Those unseen years became the foundation for everything that followed. Historians often emphasize this part of their story because it reminds us that the most remarkable accomplishments are usually built long before the world notices them. Another important lesson from the Beatles is the value of collaboration. Each member possessed different strengths, personalities, and creative ideas. There were disagreements, compromises, and moments when their opinions sharply differed. Yet, many of their greatest songs were born from those differences, rather than despite them. Their partnership demonstrated that creativity often grows strongest when people challenge one another with respect and shared purpose. Even after the group separated, each member continued speaking with admiration about the unique magic they had created together during those unforgettable years. Time eventually carried them in different directions, but the music they created remained united. That music continues crossing borders without needing translation. A melody written in Liverpool can still move listeners in cities thousands of miles away who speak completely different languages. Few forms of art possess such universal power. This is why the Beatles remain more than a famous band. They have become a symbol of what imagination, friendship, and determination can accomplish when combined with relentless dedication. Looking at their story today, it becomes clear that their greatest gift to the world was not simply a collection of unforgettable songs. It was the example they set for future generations of dreamers. They proved that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things without losing the curiosity that first inspired them. More than 60 years after four young musicians first picked up their instruments, their voices still echo through homes, concert halls, classrooms, and quiet moments around the world. Their legacy continues, not because history refuses to let them go, but because every new generation finds something meaningful within their music. As long as people continue listening, learning, and sharing those timeless songs, the remarkable journey of the Beatles will never truly fade. It will remain one of the brightest chapters in the history of modern culture, reminding us that while every performance eventually ends, truly great music has the power to continue long after the final note has disappeared into silence. In many ways, the Beatles also changed how history remembers artists. Before their rise, musicians were often seen as entertainers whose popularity would eventually fade with time. The Beatles challenged that idea by creating a body of work that continued to grow in importance long after the group had ended. Today, their songs are preserved alongside other important cultural achievements because they represent more than successful recordings. They capture the spirit of an era while also speaking to emotions that never grow old. This combination of historical significance and timeless humanity is what keeps the Beatles relevant. Generation after generation, researchers continue examining handwritten lyrics, studio recordings, personal letters, and interviews, hoping to better understand how four ordinary young men managed to create music that still resonates around the world. Every restored recording and newly discovered photograph adds another small piece to the larger story, reminding us that history is built from countless individual moments rather than a single dramatic event. The Beatles were not extraordinary every day. They argued, laughed, worried, celebrated, made mistakes, and learned from them just like anyone else. Perhaps that humanity is one of the reasons people continue feeling such a strong connection to them. Listeners recognize pieces of their own lives within the story of the band. Dreams, disappointments, friendships, ambition, and change are experiences shared by everyone, regardless of where they come from. The Beatles simply lived those experiences under the attention of the entire world. Looking back now, it becomes clear that their greatest success was not becoming famous, but remaining meaningful. Countless performers have enjoyed brief moments of worldwide popularity, yet only a few continue inspiring audiences decades later. The Beatles belong to that rare group whose influence seems to grow, rather than disappear with time. Their songs continue introducing new listeners to the past while remaining surprisingly fresh in the present. Young musicians still learn from their recordings. Historians still write about their achievements. and millions of people continue finding comfort, joy, and inspiration in melodies created more than half a century ago. As each new generation discovers their music, the story begins again in a different way, proving that true cultural legacies are never confined to the years in which they were created. Instead, they continue living through every person who listens, every artist who finds inspiration, and every dreamer who realizes that extraordinary journeys often begin with the simplest of hopes. That enduring connection between the past and the future is, perhaps, the Beatles' greatest achievement of all, ensuring that their remarkable place in history will continue for many generations yet to come. As historians continue reflecting on the Beatles, many agree that their story represents one of the clearest examples of how art can outlast the people who created it. Buildings may crumble, fashions may disappear, and technology may become outdated, but a meaningful song can travel through generations almost unchanged. This is exactly what happened with the Beatles. Their music has accompanied people through moments of celebration, reflection, joy, and sadness for more than 60 years. Every decade has introduced new challenges and new ways of listening to music. Yet Beatles recordings have remained a familiar presence, whether heard through an old record player, a car radio, a compact disc, or a streaming service. The emotions carried by their songs continue reaching listeners with the same quiet power. Historians often describe this as the sign of truly timeless art. It belongs to no single generation because every generation discovers something different within it. Some hear optimism, others hear nostalgia, while many simply enjoy the beauty of the melodies. Museums, archives, and libraries continue preserving not only their music, but also handwritten notes, recording equipment, clothing, and personal photographs, ensuring that future generations will understand both the artists and the world in which they lived. Yet perhaps the most inspiring part of the Beatles' story is that it reminds us how unpredictable history can be. When four teenagers first began performing together in Liverpool, there was no guarantee that anyone beyond their hometown would ever hear their songs. Success was uncertain, opportunities were limited, and rejection was common. Instead of giving up, they continued improving, believing that each performance could be better than the last. That determination slowly transformed an ordinary dream into one of the greatest cultural achievements of the modern era. Looking back today, it becomes clear that the Beatles were never simply recording songs. They were creating memories that millions of people would carry throughout their lives. Their music became part of weddings, birthdays, family gatherings, road trips, quiet evenings, and countless personal moments that history books can never fully capture. Perhaps that is the greatest measure of their legacy. It lives not only in museums or documentaries, but also in the hearts of ordinary listeners around the world. Every time someone hums a familiar melody, learns a Beatles song on a guitar, or introduces their music to a younger generation, the story quietly continues. And in that way, the Beatles achieved something that very few artists ever accomplish. They created a legacy that no longer belongs only to them. It belongs to everyone who continues listening, remembering, and finding inspiration in the timeless music of four young friends from Liverpool whose extraordinary journey changed the world forever. As the decades continue to pass, the Beatles remain one of the strongest reminders that true influence cannot be measured only by awards, sales figures, or records broken. Those achievements tell part of the story, but they do not explain why people still feel an emotional connection to music created so many years ago. Historians often point out that the Beatles succeeded because they captured something deeply human. Their songs spoke about hope, love, loneliness, change, and the uncertainty of growing older, feelings that remain familiar no matter when or where someone lives. Because of this, their music never became trapped in the 1960s. Instead, it continued traveling through time, finding new listeners with every generation. Schools use their story to discuss the cultural changes of the 20th century, while music academies analyze their harmonies, songwriting, and recording methods. Even scientists studying the psychology of music have explored why Beatles melodies are remembered so easily and why they continue to create emotional responses decades after they were first released. Few artists have inspired research across so many different fields. Their influence stretches from history and sociology to education and technology, proving that the Beatles became far more than entertainers. They became part of the cultural fabric of the modern world. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson their journey offers is one of perseverance. Before the applause, before the interviews, before the worldwide fame, there were years of uncertainty filled with small performances, endless rehearsals, and repeated disappointments. They kept improving because they believed their dream was worth pursuing, even when very few people believed in them. That determination continues inspiring young artists today, reminding them that success is rarely immediate and that lasting achievements are built through patience and constant effort. Looking back across more than 6 decades, the Beatles stand as proof that history is often changed not only by political leaders or scientific discoveries, but also by creative people whose ideas bring millions together. Their songs continue echoing through concert halls, homes, classrooms, and headphones across every continent. Every new listener adds another chapter to their remarkable legacy, ensuring that the story never truly becomes part of the distant past. Instead, it continues living in the present, carried forward by every voice that sings along, every musician who finds inspiration in their work, and every dreamer who remembers that 4 ordinary young men from Liverpool once believed that music could change their lives, and in the end, it changed the world. As we reach the closing chapters of this remarkable journey, it becomes clear that the Beatles left behind something far more valuable than fame. They left behind a reminder that creativity has the power to outlive every generation that experiences it. Many artists become symbols of their own time, but only a select few become symbols for all time. The Beatles earned that rare place because they never stopped searching for new ideas. Every challenge became an opportunity to learn. Every success became motivation to improve, and every setback encouraged them to look forward instead of backward. Their story demonstrates that true greatness is not achieved by avoiding change, but by embracing it with courage and imagination. Historians often describe the Beatles as a bridge between generations, because grandparents, parents, and children can all enjoy the same songs while finding different meanings within them. One listener may remember hearing those melodies during childhood, while another discovers them for the very first time through a documentary or a streaming playlist. Despite these different experiences, the emotional connection remains surprisingly similar. That ability to unite people across age, culture, and language is one of the rarest achievements in human history. The Beatles accomplished this not through speeches or political movements, but through music that spoke directly to the heart. Looking back, their journey reminds us that every extraordinary story begins with a first step that seems almost insignificant at the time. Four young friends met, shared a love for music, practiced tirelessly, and refused to abandon their dream even when success appeared distant. None of them could have imagined that historians would one day study their work, museums would preserve their instruments, and millions of people would continue listening to their songs more than half a century later. Yet, this is exactly what happened. Their legacy teaches that ordinary beginnings should never be underestimated, because history often grows from the smallest moments. Today, wherever a Beatles song is played, a small part of that remarkable journey begins again. A new listener hears the melody, wonders about the people who created it, and becomes connected to a story that started many decades ago in the streets of Liverpool. In this way, the Beatles continue inspiring curiosity, creativity, and hope long after their final performance. Their music reminds us that while time changes the world around us, truly meaningful art continues, speaking across generations without losing its voice. And that enduring message is perhaps the greatest gift the Beatles ever gave to history, a legacy that continues to grow with every person who listens, every musician who creates, and every dream that begins with the simple belief that something extraordinary is possible. Even after all these years, the Beatles continue to teach an important lesson about the meaning of legacy. Success can be counted in awards, records, or sold-out concerts, but a true legacy is measured by the lives that are inspired long after the applause has ended. That is exactly what happened with the Beatles. Millions of people who never had the chance to see them perform still feel connected to their music. Young songwriters continue learning from their melodies. Historians continue exploring their influence, and ordinary listeners continue finding comfort in songs that were written more than half a century ago. Few artists have managed to remain so deeply connected to everyday life for such a long period of time. Their music still plays during celebrations, quiet evenings, family gatherings, and moments of reflection, becoming part of memories for people across the world. This lasting presence proves that the Beatles created something much greater than entertainment. They created a shared cultural experience that continues to unite generations. Looking back at their journey, it is remarkable to remember how uncertain everything once seemed. They faced rejection from record companies, spent endless nights performing in small clubs, and worked tirelessly before anyone outside Liverpool knew their names. Every challenge strengthened them, every performance improved their confidence, and every setback prepared them for the opportunities that would eventually arrive. Their story reminds us that history is often shaped by persistence rather than luck. Great achievements usually grow slowly, built through years of dedication that few people ever witness. The Beatles never stopped learning, even after becoming the most famous band in the world. They continued experimenting, questioning themselves, and searching for new ways to express their ideas. That willingness to evolve became one of the defining reasons their music never grew old. Today, visitors still stand outside Abbey Road Studios, walk along Penny Lane, and explore the streets of Liverpool, hoping to feel a small connection to the place where it all began. Those locations have become landmarks not because of buildings alone, but because they represent the beginning of a story that changed modern culture forever. More than 60 years have passed since four young musicians first believed they could build a future through music. Their voices may belong to history, but their influence belongs to the present and the future alike. Every new listener keeps their journey alive, proving that the greatest stories never truly end. Instead, they continue through the people who remember them, share them, and discover them again, ensuring that the extraordinary legacy of the Beatles will continue inspiring the world for generations still to come. As historians continue to examine the Beatles, one theme appears again and again. Their story proves that cultural influence can be just as powerful as political or scientific achievement. While governments changed, new technologies emerged, and the world moved through decades of dramatic transformation. Beatles music remained a familiar presence. Their songs became part of the soundtrack to everyday life for millions of people, crossing borders that politics often could not. Listeners from different countries, speaking different languages and living completely different lives, could still find common ground in the same melodies. That universal appeal is one of the reasons historians continue describing the Beatles as a truly global phenomenon, rather than simply a successful British band. Their influence reached classrooms, recording studios, concert halls, libraries, museums, and even academic research. Music scholars analyze the structure of their compositions, while historians examine how their career reflected the social changes of the 20th century. At the same time, ordinary listeners continue enjoying the songs without needing any knowledge of music theory or history. This rare combination of artistic depth and widespread popularity is difficult to find anywhere else. The Beatles created music that could be appreciated on many different levels. Whether someone wanted to study every lyric or simply enjoy a beautiful melody during a quiet evening. Looking back over their remarkable journey, another important lesson becomes clear. The Beatles never allowed success to stop their curiosity. After reaching the top of the charts, they continued searching for new sounds instead of repeating the same ideas. They experimented, accepted risks, and constantly challenged themselves to improve. This willingness to grow kept their music fresh and prevented their creativity from becoming predictable. It also inspired countless future artists to believe that true success comes from continuous learning rather than remaining comfortable. Even today, new musicians often describe the Beatles as an example of artistic courage because they were never afraid to explore unfamiliar territory. Their story reminds us that lasting achievements are built through imagination combined with discipline. More than 60 years after their first recordings, the Beatles continue influencing people who were born long after the band had separated. Every generation rediscovers their music in its own way, ensuring that the journey, which began in the streets of Liverpool, never truly reaches an ending. Instead, it continues through every listener who presses play, every young musician who learns a Beatles song for the first time, and every historian who recognizes that the legacy of four ordinary friends became one of the most extraordinary cultural stories the modern world has ever known. As our journey through the history of the Beatles slowly comes to an end, it is worth pausing to reflect on why their story continues to matter after so many decades. History remembers countless famous musicians, but only a handful become symbols of an entire era. The Beatles achieved that rare distinction because they represented far more than commercial success. They embodied curiosity, friendship, resilience, and the belief that creativity could change the world. Their music accompanied moments of celebration and sorrow, inspired artists across every continent, and encouraged millions of ordinary people to dream beyond the limits of their circumstances. From the modest streets of Liverpool to the largest stages on earth, their journey demonstrated that greatness does not depend on where someone begins, but on the passion, discipline, and courage they bring to every step of the path. Even after the band separated, their influence never faded. New technologies arrived, musical trends changed, and generations grew older. Yet Beatles songs continued finding new listeners. Parents shared the music with their children, teachers introduced it in classrooms, and musicians studied it in recording studios. Every passing decade added another chapter to their legacy, rather than bringing it closer to an ending. That is the mark of truly timeless art. It belongs to the future just as much as it belongs to the past. Looking back, the Beatles remind us that success is not only measured by records sold or awards won, it is measured by the number of lives touched, the dreams inspired, and the memories created. Four ordinary young men set out simply hoping to make music together, never realizing that their voices would one day echo through history itself. Their melodies crossed borders without passports, united strangers who spoke different languages, and proved that music could become one of humanity's most universal forms of communication. More than 60 years later, those songs still bring comfort to quiet evenings, joy to family gatherings, and inspiration to artists beginning journeys of their own. Perhaps that is the most beautiful ending their story could ever have. Not an ending marked by silence, but one carried forward every time someone presses play, hums a familiar melody, or discovers the Beatles for the very first time. History often teaches us about kings, wars, and empires, yet sometimes the most lasting legacy is created by four friends with guitars who believed in one another and refused to stop dreaming. Their journey reminds us that while every life eventually reaches its final chapter, kindness, creativity, and beautiful music have the extraordinary power to live on forever. So, as the night grows quieter and this story gently comes to its close, may the legacy of the Beatles serve as a peaceful reminder that some voices never truly fade. They simply continue traveling through time, finding new hearts to inspire with every generation. Good night, and thank you for joining this journey through one of the greatest stories in the history of music.